David, thank you so much for joining me. I sent the mail out and to my subscribers at the weekend, and it said, you know, what had happened in Israel. Iran has launched this attack on Israel. Obviously, we need to talk about it. Going to get you on the show to talk about it. Do they have any questions? And I was kind of flooded with all these questions that came in. Because as I said, you're one of the most popular people that I interview. People are absolutely fascinated by your research. And I think that's because there is nobody else that really goes in depth into the geopolitical situation, that can explain what's happening on the ground, but can also put it in context of cycles, which is what my publication is all about. Because if you weren't forecasting with that knowledge in mind, you wouldn't be able to make the accuracy of your forecast, particularly regarding inflation and regarding commodity prices and the Kondratieff Wave, which really explains why we have war, which of course is all to do with land and its resources, which are essentially the fuel of nations. But welcome. It's what time in the UK? 12 p.m.
Midday, Catherine. Not a problem for me.
Nighttime here, which is challenging for me. But let's start off. I don't really know where to start. I know how these things affect me personally, and I think that that's where my subscribers come along. They are very worried about the prospects of World War III and how that's going to affect Australia. But of course, war in the Middle East is something that you foresaw happening when those events happened, those horrific events happened on October 7th. And you recognized at that time that this would be, and it was an Iranian war on Israel, that this really had nothing to do with Hamas, that Hamas was Iran's proxy, and this was an attack from Iran on Israel. Can you unpack that and bring us up to date with what's going on in the Middle East?
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually amazed at how few people understood what it meant that Hamas had attacked on the 7th of October, that it had to be at the behest of Iran, and it had to be because Iran had decided to trigger finally its moment of first covert and then subsequently overt war against Israel. And I think in their wildest dreams, they couldn't have hoped for a more dreamy and delusional Western response to that particular incident. And their plan. And their plan wasn't in isolation either, because they're part of the axis of autocracy. They watched Russia invade Ukraine. And I have to say that Biden's response failed to deter Putin from going forwards. He then was sort of devolved into a state of Pavlov's dog through the nuclear threats that Putin made. And Biden was terrified of the idea of escalation, which is what Putin's thesis of escalate to de-escalate in 2019 was. It was drop a single nuclear small tactical nuke somewhere and you'll push the weak Western leadership into abeyance and you'll get what you want. And Biden behaved exactly like that. And in the process, failed to respond quickly to what was going on. Britain did, I think, thanks to a post-Brexit degree of lateralization under Boris. And then subsequently, the whole American strategy has been based on, and I'm talking about Ukraine because it's significant and it links through to what Iran's doing and how it thinks. So I haven't avoided your question. I'm just trying to frame the whole answer in effect. And so Biden then, fearful still of escalation, created a stalemate strategy, which meant that the spring offensive and the summer offensive last year had no chance of succeeding because in any combined arms operation in history, air dominance has been a prerequisite for ground mobility and movement and success. And the Ukrainians didn't even have neutrality. They didn't control the airspace above them. The Russians did more than they did. So the idea of expecting them to move forward was absolutely ludicrous and part of Biden's stalemate, which was, we can't beat Russia, but we'll try and ablate it and we'll use Ukrainian blood and give them just enough weapons so they can carry on fighting, which was reprehensible in every degree. Because the amount of money we've spent on Ukraine is absolutely teeny compared to our GDPs, our defense budgets. And yet, in the process, Russia's been seriously ablated in its current combat ability, but now it's moved to a wartime footing, spending at least 10% of its GDP and moving forwards ever more. And the big mistake the West has really made is it doesn't understand that Russia, like Iran, is a commodity producing country, which means as we face inflation, as commodities go up in the constriction phase of war, essentially they get wealthier. And of course, they have a commodity that China wants, so they build their alliance even more strongly with $260 billion worth of trade and going up. There's now lethal aid coming from China to Russia because there's no way China's going to let Russia fail. And we're probably locked in two sides of an equation, with the West on one side and the axis of autocracy on the other, with North Korea, Iran, China all supporting Russia's war. And on top of that, we've had the Magda Republicans, which I can only say are very similar to Oswald Mosley's brown shirts in Britain in 1930, because they have literally, with Trump, sided for Putin and weakened the case, because normally in American politics, you have a weak side and a strong side when it comes to conflict. But Biden's stalemate has been weak, and his concept has been weak. And Trump has almost betrayed America in the process of supporting Putin by saying that he'd end it in a day, force Ukraine to its knees, to accept any terms. I mean, that is a construct which has emboldened the leaders of autocracy. So you can see that the Iranians faced some interesting issues. Number one, they faced, and why they decided to trigger the conflict, was the concern that Israel and Saudi Arabia would be closer than ever. But the other is their economic paradigm has been really shaky. Inflation inside Iran, with the sanctions and the dynamics of their economy, was so bad that they must have felt they had to go to war to essentially hold the whole thing together. And their time was emboldened by the weakness the West showed. So Hamas was the first activator. Hezbollah's been chipping away to the north. And if any country in the West suffered the kind of attacks that Hezbollah have been laying on Israel, we would have gone and flattened them. So why we expect Israel to accept this continuous pummeling of their northern borders, where 100,000 Jews are now forced to go and live out of their homes because they're not safe, is beyond me, in terms of our response. But obviously, what happened was Israel, faced with the process of the Hamas Gaza incident, made Gaza and the subjugation of their left flank, in effect, its priority. And part of that process is to remove the missile capability that would then start to impinge upon its Iron Dome. And that's obviously been done. And I wrote about the next step is, once they've done that, they'll start to go north and they'll seek to secure their northern borders, because Hezbollah has 150,000 rockets, which, if they all launched them relatively simultaneously, would saturate all of the Iron Dome defenses very quickly. So that's one sword of Damocles. And I think when they attacked the Syrian consulate, or the consulate in Syria, with the IRGC members on board, it was part of their process now. They'd pulled out of Gaza and they were ready to escalate the process, in effect, of starting to go for Hezbollah. And the Iranians faced a problem. They didn't want to lose their proxy. So they tried to, that's why they decided to mount this full-scale attack. And the full-scale attack was not designed, in my opinion, to be ablated by the West. Well, they didn't expect that. They had over 120 ballistic missiles fired on top of their drones and cruise missiles. And there's no way that that scale of attack, which, by the way, is bigger than anything Russia has delivered to Ukraine in a single strike, should be expected to be swatted out of the sky. And I think that it only was because of the speed of the alliance. And one of the things the West should learn is that there was an information war against Israel being conducted. And that information war hit two locations. It hit Biden's election prospects from his liberals. And that's why Biden continuously, kept putting the foot down against Israel. And I would argue that in Britain, Sunak was actually pro-Israeli until Cameron came along, who's, before he became foreign secretary, was in the pay of various Arab counterparties, and essentially is incredibly pro-Arabic and anti-Israeli, and he joined in for his own reasons. And the net effect was a perception from Iran was one of, they had successfully dislocated Israel from their Western allies, and therefore that was another moment why they felt boldened enough to launch their missile strike. So we need to learn that lesson. We walked straight into a series of traps. Yes, Israel didn't do well in the first 5-10 days of combat. There's no doubt that they lashed out more than they should have done. But subsequently, they've conducted an urban conflict, I think, with considerable fire discipline, in which the casualties would be 10 times greater. I think perhaps their view about the humanitarian aid wasn't very clever in terms of looking after the population, because ultimately Hamas wanted its own population to die to win the information war, and Israel didn't want them to, and they didn't do enough to protect them. And now there's a very bizarre turnaround where a government of a region, and let's be honest, this is not a terrorist operation. Basically, Hamas was a government in the Gaza Strip and had been there, and they'd used the aid to basically fortify the location. But they had one unique quality: they wanted their population to die as part of their war. There's never in history been a case where a country or a government is prepared to sacrifice their population so readily. And the Israelis were prepared to, or had to, then look after them to some degree. I think they should have gone further if I, was able to say you could have done this better. And if they had, they might have probably held the link to the West better. But the net result, and we should all be really aware of this, is that the information war, I think, created the perception to Iran that essentially there was a separation between Israel and everyone else. So they must have been very surprised when Britain and the US came to their aid and actually added to the shield. I think we should ask ourselves the question, why was there such a motivated drive to knock all the missiles out the sky? And now's the big answer, and that is, we don't know whether Iran has developed a nuclear weapon yet. And the same technology that essentially allowed Hamas to surprise Israel, which is hardline telephones and notes on pieces of paper and pencils, basically is probably being employed by the Iranians because they taught them how to do it to shield their program. Estimates suggest they have at least enough enriched uranium for 3 bombs. You have to assume that the close liaison with Russia is such that the technology to militarize has already been available. So actually, I think when the threat and the intelligence warned of an impending Iranian attack, for the commanders of various countries, the question is, what happens if 2 of those or 1 of those weapons has a nuclear bomb on? We have to have 100% protection for Israel. Otherwise, it's all change. And I think only something like that would have driven the alliance so quickly together. So it's absolutely bizarre that having had this mass missile strike, the net response from the West was essentially, oh, restrain yourself. I mean, come on, let's be really honest. Israel was attacked in an all-out missile strike, the biggest since the V1 strikes, even bigger because they came over in dribs and drabs, and the V2s essentially not in mass. But the net effect is we've just seen a country that's our ally or a Western ally be attacked, and not the first time because they were attacked by Hamas the first time, and the Hezbollah in between, and all the West could do in Biden and Sunak was to say, restrain yourself. It's mad. Now, they came up with a very interesting solution, and I don't think it's the end of it. They obviously took an F-35 and launched a long harm missile and killed a radar site. And what they're saying to the Iranians is, you won't see us. We can do whatever we want. So basically, don't back off. But the Iranians are probably thinking, we didn't fire all our missiles. We've got a whole load more missiles. They're not very accurate. They've got circular error probabilities of 500 feet. So when someone tells you they aimed at a swimming pool, it's only luck because they couldn't hit a swimming pool for love nor money intentionally. But nonetheless, they could saturate the defensive system with ballistic systems. And so the Iranians are thinking, well, we've still got a lever. We've still got Hezbollah with 150,000 rockets, which would also simultaneously do great harm. And all the Iranians did was basically, the Israelis did was say, we could do this. The simple thing is they have 2 swords of Damocles over their head, Hezbollah, and its 150,000 rockets, and the nuclear program of Iran. Until both of those are removed, Israel cannot feel secure, and Israel is at war, even if the West thinks they can suppress the process. And at the same time, you must remember the Red Sea is closed thanks to the Houthis. And America as a maritime hegemony has totally failed to keep a seaway open, which is a bigger failure than Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan put together. If you can't control your sea lanes, your maritime hegemony is over. And that success has now emboldened the Chinese, whose whole strike capability against Taiwan and the Asian basin is based on much more sophisticated versions of those ballistic systems, killing warships and carriers. So we have got ourselves into this horrendous hole. And all we're seeing is appeasement. We got here because of appeasement, and the appeasers are just doubling down. And what's very interesting when you look at Chamberlain, and we often think of Chamberlain as the arch appeaser, and yes, he did. He fought in the First World War. He didn't want another war, and he really did try to appease Hitler through the Czechoslovakian deal. But at the same time, he was also supporting a massive rearmament program. So he was hedging his bets. In the case of America, Biden's done nothing to actually accelerate arms and development, and more importantly, the technological race that America's losing, which made it vulnerable to hypersonic weapons and anti-ship ballistic missiles. And Sunak in this country has actually weakened our defenses throughout the whole process. So I'm afraid we no longer have Chamberlain as the arch appeaser. We have Sunak as the super arch appeaser and Biden as the appeaser. And they're magnitudes of order worse, I would argue, than Chamberlain. And the population needs to understand that, because war comes through two components. It comes through a human predator in charge of a system that's expansive, in this case, the autocratic system of China. Russia isn't expansive, but he joined in anyway. Iran is, and North Korea is. And only when they face, in effect, weakness and appeasement on the other side, does the predator really strike. So it's twofold. And it's all about an aggressor and an appeaser, someone who refuses to defend themselves, that then lets the aggressor think they have a chance and it's a free, easy kill. Because even predators don't like to take risk if they think going forward can harm them. At the moment, we're not putting our enemies at risk. We're just saying, come and attack me, and we maybe will stop them. And if we do, come and have another go later on when you're ready. And that is very dangerous.
There's so much to unpack there, but I mean, the analysis is so exceptional compared to what we hear on mainstream media here, which is all focused on, what's going on the ground in Gaza. Isn't Israel a bully? How many people have died? Which I don't even know that those figures can possibly be accurate. I think it's actually...
Well, they are from the Hamas authorities, so they're not accurate. And you also know that there's a significant number of Hamas fighters, which isn't included, because they're in the same number.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, it took Israel many weeks, and I think even now they haven't worked out how many people actually died on October 7th. And obviously there's been many more deaths since, with the war going on. Death and injury is happening all the time. So to come up with such accurate figures about how many people have died is quite astounding. And of course there's still 133 hostages which are still captive in Gaza. The cry from the public in Israel has always been, release the hostages. You have a ceasefire if you release the hostages.
I fear an awful lot of them aren't alive anymore. If you look at the path of the negotiations, the Palestinians, the Hamas groups couldn't provide the 40 hostages to create an agreement. So I'm afraid that that's sadly probably, a very diminished number. And much as I feel for the people of Gaza who have been betrayed by their own people and find themselves in a war zone, it's a horrendous concept, these people caught as hostages. But there is something that's really difficult for us in the West. This is not peace in a hostage situation. This is war. And in war, we rarely ever take account into hostages. They're called prisoners of war. But we don't, we can do prisoner swaps. But at the same time, the same process of importance that we place in peacetime on hostages actually has to diminish, because there are bigger things and there are more lives at stake. So I'm afraid I think we're in that domain. And that's a terrible thing for those caught in that position. And I really, really feel for them and their families. They must be in a terrible way. But we're now in something that's so much bigger, that involves and puts so many more lives at risk unless we take the right actions.
Because it is the festival of Passover at the moment, and of course the first Seder, which is the celebration meal for the first night of Passover, was last night, and I think many seats were left empty at the tables because everyone's feeling the weight of those hostages. It really has impacted, and it surprises me I think that there's no other region in the world that inflames unrelated populations more than what happens in Israel, with the protests that we've seen on the ground here, that you see in London. And
a really good example that's hard, I think, for us in the secular West to understand is, I don't know whether you followed much about the red heifers and the temple movement. But
yes.
But it is, what I'm going to sort of mention. I don't normally talk about superstition and ritual, because it has a role in empires and systems, but it does have a role here because the temple movements really tried to breed pure red heifers, because of the legend that on the 10th heifer sacrifice, the third temple can be built on the Temple Mount. It just happens to be over acutely a religious site for the Islamic world. So there has been a lot of talk about it, and talk, I don't know whether it'll come true, but if it were to come true, if a red heifer had been bred and was sacrificed, the significance to the hardline Jewish settlers is significant. Their influence over Netanyahu is significant, and the concerns that the Islamic Palestinians and other nations would have would be significant. Now, anywhere else in Europe, such a thing would not happen. But it shows you there are deeply entrenched traditions and constructs which underlying why groups won't talk to each other, why they fight with each other, that really most in the West don't understand. And, you know, I did a piece actually yesterday articulating fact and fiction over the whole construct of the red heifer sacrifice and what it means. And all I can conclude is that if it were to come true in this Passover period, it would be a significant inflammatory moment that would, you know, have all sorts of implications. And I'm not sure that Israel has really finished, honestly, with Iran. I suspect that they've ended up with an aid package, which is about to go through the Senate following Congress. So they've got support. But I don't think that any war cabinet can allow Iran to be so close to a nuclear breakout after demonstrating a total act of war. Because who is in doubt that if they could, they would use a nuclear weapon against Israel? And I think the thing that people don't understand, and this is really hard at this stage, and I hear your listeners' concern, because I am deeply concerned, and I'll tell you a story, you know, about how much it's affected me. Is I started on this course in 2005 when my twins arrived. And I was dyslexic, and I was speaking as a CIO about the theses which we've been talking about since we met. And people said, you've got to write a book. And I said, I can't, I'm dyslexic, it's never going to happen. But when my twins arrived, I realized I had to explain to people what was inevitable at this Kondratieff cycle peak and the decline of the West and the rise of China leading to World War III, that I thought was already obvious by the way China was behaving. Even then in 2005, it was clear that they had a duplicitous, you know, agenda between Western investment and something else by stealing all our IP from the beginning. And I was able to start writing, strangely enough. And I've been warning ever since, as in the coldest, most educated way, that we were coming to this danger point. And I thought at this stage we would be probably in a state like we were at the peak of the Cold War, like heightened awareness, like spending on defense, elbows out, showing integrity and strength, and trying to push back wherever we were pushed. In my wildest dreams, I didn't expect us to be so delusional, so in denial about the threat we face, and so relatively weak in our leadership. And that weakness is not just because the leaders are weak, it's because the electorate is weak. We fail to understand in our beautiful, lovely end of cycle world that essentially other systems might prey upon us. And the price for that failure, and I hold my generation really responsible, maybe the one below in this, is that we have bequeathed a dangerous world with almost inevitable conflict on the most significant level, and our children will have to pay for that. They're our most priceless possession. And every parent who's been of this generation should look at themselves in the mirror and realize how they have failed their own children by failing to have the courage to look at the aggressor coming towards us and demanding action. And I've got children. I've got three children. I've got two boys, and they're right in the line of fire. And I feel so angry that having dedicated so much of my resources, it's been so much worse a response. It took me weeks to actually sort of get rid of that and just let it go. Now, you know, we are where we are, but people need to wake up, and quickly, because time is running out. If you're China, you've looked at a total failure in Ukraine. You've looked at a weakness in deterrence with Iran. Is it next North Korea that goes? It may well be before China makes its move, because all three of its Axis allies have started their regional conflict. I wouldn't be surprised at all if North Korea went before China, but I wouldn't be surprised if China went anyway soon. So we are in this danger zone, and yes, we've precipitated this by our collective Western weakness.
There was already a lot to unpack from your last day, and there's like even more to unpack. I mean, it's interesting what you were saying about the red heifer, because you know, I've in my own personal life, I have had times where I'm Jewish. There's been times where I've been very religiously Jewish, So I followed all of these trends that have happened in Israel over the years. And, you know, there's always been a talk that, you know, Israel would never let the third temple be constructed. And there have always been efforts to do it, because of course it would cause, well, first of all, you would have to have a re-establishment of the priesthood. I don't know whether all of that, there's many things via law that would make it very tricky to do that. But can you imagine the sacrifice of animals actually happening in a temple, which would be what it would lead to, and the outcry and the potential, you know, of how that would inflame an already very difficult situation. So, you know, we've always said the government probably will never allow that to happen, but it doesn't stop the ultra religious making those, you know,
It doesn't.
fanaticals.
And what's interesting about conflict is it always moves any country's politics to the right, always. And so much as it might have been a strange idea in peace, it isn't a strange idea now that a group might try and do that, for all the significance it represents for Israel, at a time when it feels completely besieged. It can't trust its allies, although we did come to support over the missile attack. But before that, we completely lost our way in supporting Israel. And, you know, even this issue over the brigade, I think, in the West Bank, there's no doubt Israel's action in the West Bank consistently undermined its affiliation and link to the West. But it's quite interesting that America's trying to penalize this particular battalion and individuals in it. And they should, don't get me wrong, ensure that it doesn't happen and their behavior is moderate. But normally what you're meant to do is do that behind closed doors. And you're meant to have a conversation and say, but get your guys in order. That can't happen anymore. Stop behaving in an inflammatory way because you're weakening our overall cause. To do this publicly is all about Biden's election. It's all about him getting points, where having helped Israel, now he has to pay off and look like he's on the balance and moderation. And these games are games that just weaken us. They're political games that do not have a place in the run-up to conflict when an enemy is looking for any crack to cleave open wider.
Let's break down the real estate that we're dealing with here, because I don't know that people understand the significance of Israel as a piece of real estate to the West. What is Israel's importance? Why can the West not allow Israel to fall?
Well, I think less the West and more America, because when America assumed the hegemonic position after 1945, Britain was actually pro-Arabic. It didn't really want Israel to rise as a state. And Israel received the support from America that facilitated success in its civil war that created the Israeli state. So you can think of Israel as the island of the American hegemonic system. And if a hegemonic system loses a crucial island or entity that it's created, it is the beginning of the end for it. So Israel is significant in America's future, first. Secondly, it's obviously located in the Middle East, and the Middle East controls, constrains, produces oil, which then affects inflation globally. Whether America is a single producer or not, and I get people telling me, well, you know, they can just shut the doors and price oil themselves. It's not that simple. We still have globalized markets. We still have Europe that's afflicted by it, even if America isn't. So there isn't that sense of isolation readily available. So it is a controlling mechanism. And it's also now the seat of Iran, which is a regional power with nuclear aspirations, which is building longer and longer rocketry. So as far as the security of the West is concerned, it's no longer just about being somewhere over there at the tip of the Mediterranean. It's actually about a power that, like North Korea, can start coming into our territory, destroying our cities if it so chooses. So Israel is key in that respect. It's also an incredibly innovative location. If you look at missile defenses, which they've been forced to create for their own survival, some of those technologies are then fed back into our Western technologies. And I often think about the simple process of a few countries have tried to actively protect their tanks. But the active protection systems on Merkava tanks have been remarkable, and soft-skin vehicles. Really remarkable, as proven once more in Gaza. So Israel makes great technology because it has to survive. And right now, that's quite important because we all need that technology to survive. So, and the other thing too, is democratic. It's the only democratic oasis in the region. And therefore, as a construct of democracy, seeing a democracy snuffed out would be very dangerous for us. So those three reasons, it's a non-negotiable. Israel has to survive. It does need to be moderate in some of its dealings, which would help it a lot easier. But we're all about to be bonded as we were by the mass Iranian attack, by just a range of threats, which is so much bigger than the ones we've been squabbling over.
And wasn't it a miracle that none of those rockets actually caused any physical injury on the ground? I mean, that's what it's being termed as in Israel, that it was a miracle, and Jordan stepped in to help.
I don't think it was. So let me describe it. It wasn't a miracle. It was an example of extremely good preparation and investment in the appropriate defensive technology against what was the clearest threat to Israel's security. So whether it's Iron Dome or it's a David Sling, which is a more advanced version of essentially the Patriot system, or whether it's Arrow 3 that made an exothermic intercept, first time we've known in combat that to happen. And then integrated with American technology and American X-band radars. That's an integrated air defense that everyone would dream of. If Ukraine had Israel's air defenses, half the problems they're going through wouldn't happen, period. So on top of that, when threatened by saturation, I suspect that the Americans delivered Patriot batteries from the back of C-17s. It just rolled out. It's a small country. It benefits from being small, therefore you can concentrate defense. Whereas in Ukraine, it's big and it's much harder. So I think the Americans would have reinforced with Patriots. And then, of course, you had the air intercepts that were of the simple, slow-flying drones that were not, any different than intelligent V1s going back to the Second World War. But I think Israel could have done a pretty good job of, I think, intercepting that barrage on its own. But there would have been some that got through. And I think the threat was what happens if one of them's had a nuclear tip, because we didn't see the breakout in time. And therein is the challenge that we all face right now in the West and Israel, which was we have to assume the Iranians have a nuclear weapon.
Yes. What about the oil fields? Because obviously Israel is, gas producer, have these large gas fields that Israel controls now. Have you looked into that? Because I think there was talk about Israel supplying Europe with gas.
Look, the gas fields of the Mediterranean are, they're basically more and more are coming online. And obviously Turkey has used gas flows as a way of becoming an energy network nexus. I don't think energy is really what Israel's survival is about right now. It's those three things that I mentioned that I consider to be the priority. And so we need to make sure they do. The problem is that Israel is led by a man who is extremely unappealing, is deeply self-centered and deeply flawed. And the difficulty you've got is that so we know full well that Netanyahu needs war to continue to survive, because when he comes out, it's not going to look very good for him. That's not a good thing normally. Except for in this case, the war wasn't started by Israel, it was started by Iran. So strangely enough, at this particular stage, this war is not going to go away until one side or the other have surrendered. This is a rigid, long-term conflict.
How does this escalate from here? Because, the comments that came, there's a very smart analyst that I talked to on the ground here, Louis Christopher, who's actually, he looks at the markets, he looks at the housing market, he looks at the stock market, and he makes annual forecasts, and they're actually very accurate because he's a smart guy. But, he is also looking at what's happening globally, and he's possibly one of the only commentators on the ground that I think has understood perhaps some of the consequences of what we might see if war breaks out in the Middle East. But as soon as that happened, that Iranian attack happened, and Israel retaliated because he put a graph in a tweet, went out looking at what was happening to oil prices and said, we're now really on the brink of a global war. I know you say that we're already in World War III, but from here on, inflation, oil price spikes. We had a lot of commentary that has been coming in over the last few months about we're on top of inflation, they're going to be cutting rates, there'll be rate cuts, this is the end of inflation, and then, you know, woof, what's that going to do to the property market? I never said that, obviously, because the Kondratieff cycle would not indicate that whatsoever if you're looking at war and rising commodity prices, which is the prime forecast of that cycle. And obviously the cycle which I also talk about, the 18-year property cycle, the 18-year land cycle, wouldn't indicate that as well. But that is the reality of what we're facing now. We are facing something that has been sparked off, which is going to impact the essential supply lines that come through that region. That means that Iran, you know, is obviously going to be vying to control that area and the supply lines, and that would mean ongoing inflation for us and a very challenging environment, I would expect. Can you unpack what we're facing now?
So at the end of this, I'm going to, you mentioned that that wars are about resources, and they're about, you know, the conflict is about creating more resources. At the end of it, I'm going to come back and I'm going to expand on something which I've started to look at this a different way, but that's one of the symptoms of something more fundamental. When it comes to inflation, you're absolutely right. We are now in this giant inflationary pulse, and oil is going to 250, and the breakout of gold and silver and Bitcoin was something I warned all my clients long before, means something really big was coming down the track, because the safe havens were breaking out when nothing was obvious. And that was, you know, obviously you can say China bought gold, some people in the know, but I always look for market moves that time events, which I also knew with this window, this period was coming up. So we were well prepared timing wise by the market triggers. What we're looking at is, you know, unlike the central banks that have this deluded hubristic concept that they control their own economies, and that the global economy somehow has very little influence from sort of forces from the outside, they failed to see the first inflationary pulse, which was supply constriction, and they failed to understand that we're going to have supply constriction again, and it's going to destroy all of their nasty, entrenched ideas they can keep printing money, because it'll have different outcomes. So we're in for that, and oil is on the cusp. Funnily enough, the metals are moving, copper's metal moving, even nickel's moving. So you're seeing the complex moving of resources, which is consistent with this period as we move into global, fully blown conflict. And the patterns are so clear, they're set now. All you can do is minimize the damage. You can't change the outcomes, in my opinion. And there are two elements to that: is inflation is going to surge, rates are going to surge, and somehow in this, the West has to work out a fund a war effort, which is a decade long, when we're already at levels that actually should be there after you fought the war. So I'm deeply concerned about the integrity of our financial system to sustain conflict. Now, if you take the lessons of Russia, when everyone was saying, we're going to put sanctions and we're going to squeeze our economy, I was laughing and saying, you know, it's like taking a knife to a gunfight, and we've got the knife and he's got the gun, because it's a resource producing country as resources keep going up. And we haven't really seen the price of oil move up since the start of the war. When that happens, his coffers are going to be very full, and the Chinese will obviously be the main buyers, probably at discounted prices. Now, interesting enough, when you look at Iran's inflation levels have been very high, which is a bit counterintuitive. And it's almost like consumer economies follow the Kondratieff cycle, but actually the inflationary dynamics of the oil producers or commodity producers is the opposite of that. And so you can have high inflation when you mismanage your economy and you have low revenues. Now, the evidence when I looked at Iran is Iran may have started feeling economically impoverished and vulnerable, and inflation has basically forced the clerics to go to war. But actually, I see the signs that their inflation is about to fall, because more and more of their production is increasing from demand from China, and their debt's been repaid on for the past 3 years. So they are not in a weakened state, as you read in the press, and they're not so weak that they can't afford war. It's the opposite. They currently actually can see the benefits from higher oil prices actually solving their financial problem, as it did for Putin. So we need to think, you know, stop projecting our consumer Western world's economy onto the producers of commodities, have the diametrically opposite dynamic. And so that's one of the things I was reading in the paper today. I was laughing because you could just see from the graphs that the things that were being said by the person that wrote it were completely null and void when you looked at the evidence in front of them. And that's one of the problems. We somehow think that everyone else is weak compared to us, and we don't realize how weak we are, and how they, in fact, have asymmetric strengths, which they're using against us.
Kondratieff's analysis, I was actually talking to someone the other day about it, because we sort of wheel it off. Okay, there's this Kondratieff cycle, and it's, you know, roughly 25 years up, 25 years down. And this chap during the time of Stalin discovered it, and then he was murdered at the age of 46. And you kind of throw out all of this. But the analysis that he did, and at the time that he did it, which would have been a painstaking task, wouldn't it, to pull together all of the data sets, all the information that he did, to source that information, to pull the data sets together, and then to correlate, you know, between different data sets, and to work out how to read what he's looking at. The analysis was really phenomenal at the time. I mean, so much so because it was, you know, they tried to write him out of history, really. I mean, it was, you know, once he was executed, you know, it was like, well, we'll wipe him out, and we'll bury all the work that he's done. And it was really Shumter who brought that back to light. The importance of that work. You've obviously studied the Kondratieff, you know, it's allowing us here now in 2023 and 2024 to make these, you know, remarkable forecasts regarding the economy. What is the impact? I'm interested as to the research that you've done on him, and if you can try and conceptualize for listeners as to how remarkable that research was that has.
Well, I think anyone that sees something for the first time, by gathering data and coming to conclusions which go against the collective shared perspective, is A, courageous, and B, a visionary. Now, there's no doubt he saw something that we have no other records that someone else saw, which was a cycle of some kind that was marked by inflation, and correlated to somewhere on those inflation spikes were conflicts. And that was what I picked up back in the mid-90s as a student of war and someone who was an investor. I was fascinated by that. But it's only recently that I think he actually happened upon something that's even bigger than an observation. And he couldn't articulate it because, you know, we have to be 100 years on to understand different perspectives. And I'm going to describe this to you now about how I've evolved my perspective of what we are and how we are. And it changes many, many outputs of the observation. So we create empires. Humans have a survival strategy because we live in a world of entropy. And entropy is this world where order goes to disorder. So obviously, individually, we work hard, we try and cook, we keep clean, keep ourselves clean. All of those things are about pushing back disease, giving us longevity, and so we can survive. But we, as human beings, chose social groups to enhance individual anti-entropy. And those groups, when they work really well, are greater than the sum of their parts. And as they got bigger, they became more coherent at times. So empire cycles are marks of coherency of collective human anti-entropy, what we then use to create order, whether it's water, sewage, all the things which civilization has brought us, diversified supplies of food from Egypt and Spain and North Africa, if you're Rome. So no one country could have a drought and Rome wouldn't starve. There was diversification. And there's no coincidence that Rome entered its period of empire polytheistically with many gods. And because it controlled its environment, it could actually adopt monotheism, which was a single god. It was indicative of the amount of control civilization and order had imbued society. So this idea that we create empires, the curves are basically anti-entropic at the peak, and then they go down and they go up. That's what the curve is. So the measure of social coherence is empire power. And every single system that we have, every peak is higher than the last collectively of these empires we build. There's more anti-entropy, there's more order, and over history, that's our success. With some tricky, unexpected consequences like climate change, we still got to deal with. But on the whole, we live longer as a result of that. Very successful survival strategy. There are more human beings as a result. So for our DNA, this has been a winning strategy. But what happens when you end up with an old, powerful person who's sort of doddery, and along comes a challenger? And important for the rate of evolution and growth is that the old is swept aside by the new. And sadly, that's been done in history by conflict. And the role of conflict is actually integrally linked to our evolution, because what happens in these empire curves is they're built by lateral thought and they're lost by linear collective thought that's unadaptive. And when you go to war, if you're going to win, two sides being equal, it's the most adaptive side that beats the most rigid linear side. So war is our evolutionary process that catalyzes lateral thinking and creates these periods like Pax Britannia afterwards of great peace and globalization, or Pax America after the war until now. And then they're punctuated when the system becomes old with conflict, swept aside, and either that system relateralizes itself or it's swept aside, and a more adaptive system comes up after it. Now, if you were to go and look at human system and you didn't want it to stand still for centuries with one old power that just couldn't be displaced, you want something like a drumbeat that basically regulates the points of challenge. And I think Kondratieff fell across what the wave that he sees is an entropic surge that somehow pulses through humanity. It dislocates, increases polarization, and it catalyzes conflict at that particular time of the pulse. And the conflict is also linked to inflammation, which we call inflammation. The system produces inflation. That's all it is. Inflammation of the system creates inflation. And so we see this pulse, but this pulse is not a 56-year pulse. It's actually a biannual pulse of 112, because that's when the hegemonic conflicts are triggered. And once they're triggered, they go on until they're resolved. So right now we're in a Kondratieff peak, which is a hegemonic peak with China versus the West. And the ultimate determinant is not China and America, it's democracy versus autocracy. Go back 112 years, and it's actually Germany versus Britain. And Germany was more autocratic than Britain. In fact, even though they were both monarchies, one was very dictatorial and one was not. Okay, same struggle. Go back to the Napoleonic era and you'll find Britain challenging France. And that peak triggered it. Now, it may take 30 years before the war is resolved, but the trigger happens on the volt phase of that entropic surge that we think of as a Kondratieff phase. And once the catalyst of conflict has started, it runs its course until it's concluded. And they can last 20 to 30 years. They're long, drawn-out struggles. And that's what we've embarked on.
That's really frightening. I'm going to throw in some of the questions that I've had from subscribers, because, you know, when I talk to subscribers, I was mentioning this to you before we hit the record button, and there's real fear from the information that you share. I mean, there was one chap that wouldn't join my service because he said that I was promoting you and that he couldn't agree with that. He felt that I was promoting the person that walks down the street calling, you know, the time is nigh. And he said, we can't allow ourselves to think that we're on the brink of World War III. He came around. I sent you the response eventually from him, you know, which was when I'd sent him the interview that we had done. I said, okay, you might not join, but here's the link for the interview. Have a look and see. And we had a bit of email correspondence, and he eventually came back and said, I've seen the light. I agree with him, and I was wrong, because I think that's where the terror comes from. When, you know, you're not someone that's just walking down the street with, you know, tolling the bell and telling us all that, you know, the end is nigh. You're actually presenting us with a very accurate analysis of what is going on now, and then based on history you're forecasting the future, you know, with this kind of cyclical analysis. And so the information that I get from them when I put out questions is, you know, really simple, as in really basically, how is this going to affect me on the ground? One is, you know, obviously people are frightened that the war might come into, you know, one's asked, would the war with China be a short-term affair or a long drawn-out affair? I think you've just answered that. But, you know, one of the questions, is there any chance of conflict actually taking place on Australian soil? If not initially, what about later on? How is this going to affect the Aussies, David?
Well,
what's going to happen to us?
Okay, so
You
so
feel
your rugby's not going to get any better, so don't worry about that.
nice response.
Okay,
Yeah.
I think you just need to go back to the expansion of the Japanese Empire, and exactly how Japan spread across the Pacific Basin is exactly what China will replicate. And AUKUS was much more than submarines. It was laying the foundation of an Australian-American alliance that meant Australia became, as it did do in the Second World War, the fight back bastion to try and fight back and get the region back. Far enough out of range from the intermediate ballistic weapons that China just has now, but that's what you are, and you will need defending again. You're going to face the same moment when the Japanese came into the Coral Sea. Only this time they'll probably come in with a lot more than 2 carriers when the time comes. So yes, you're not immediately, but you are a target. Your iron ore, your resources are what the system needs, and if they don't pay for it, they'll take them. So you need to be able to defend yourself, and you need your allies to be strong enough to help you defend yourself, because you are at great risk. I think New Zealand is really lost because it's so easily subsumed, that they've gone. But I can see you acting like Britain in this particular conflict did with respect to Europe, like an aircraft carrier right on its doorstep. You're further away. And that's also why the proposition of forward defense strategies that use missile forces and capabilities further north of you to deny access to Chinese forces is so important. You need a forward defense system and a forward defense mindset. The idea of having nuclear submarines is great, but you won't get them in time. And the Americans can't produce enough to give you any. So you're not going to have them. You're going to be reliant on American submarines, and Britain doesn't have enough to do its jobs. So all of the things that were talked about are lovely, but they should have been done 10 years ago, not 20 years in the future. And yes, you are at great risk, I'm afraid to say.
Because the person that sent that in, I think that there is, he's a father, and he's really concerned that the Australian government could bring back conscription. And I mean, I think that's a difficult question, but geographically, what countries and locations on the planet, this is from the same person, are likely to suffer least and be relatively immune from regional conflicts and World War III?
I don't think anyone is going to be immune from this conflict. We call World War I a world war, and really it was no bigger in scope than the Napoleonic Wars or the 7 Years' War in 1755 or whatever it was. But this is different. This will be a global war. We are going to fight the Chinese, 1/5 of the world's population. So they will demand all of their population mobilize, and we will have to mobilize our population, technology or no technology. And it will be long and drawn out because there is no swift conclusion from the initial strikes I expect China to make, just as Iran tried to make them on Israel. And we are going to be locked in a struggle. For the Chinese, the first step is to push America out of the Asian basin. The second step is to consolidate the industrial capabilities of Japan and North Korea and South Korea. And then they will build thousands of warships. And they will come out one day as America came out from the west coast of America, and they will be unstoppable in the sheer size of their fleets unless we find other weapon systems to counter them. So we can't counter their industrial base, especially if it's well-footed and founded. What we have to do is create systems which are technologically advanced to have any parity. And that's quite a challenge because the evidence is that the innovation cycle in China is now superior to that of the West. And take, for example, a railgun, which was the basis of medium-range air defense for the US Navy, and they couldn't make it work, so they gave up in 2021. And guess who now just made one work? The Chinese. That scares me an awful lot. It scares me they built hypersonic weapons before us, designed to kill warships that we can't stop. And people tell me they're corrupt and they're not capable, but I would say missiles don't respect corruption. If they're designed to work and they go through the right protocols, they fire enough of them, they're sophisticated enough, and they come in surprise, then they will do their damage.
I had a question regarding that because, you've obviously done so much research on weaponry. I mean, this is something that has kind of obsessed you since you were younger, right? War and conflict, and you sort of roll these things off your tongue as the, hypersonic weaponry and, who's got weapons and what they can do. Nobody out here really understands. I mean, I certainly don't, got any idea of what these weapons could do. So one of the questions I had was, question I have for David Murrin is about new missiles that China, Russia, Iran have developed that half of the US fleet are unable to detect, defend against. Could you ask him to explain again what they are and basically how they operate, and whether our side, the US, has made any developments to counter them? I mean, that kind of rolls on a bit from what you said, but can you kind of explain it a little bit better for people like us?
So I wrote Red Lightning just about this topic to warn the world. And so the story really starts with identifying China as a rising power. And all rising powers have never failed to take their economic power and militarize it. But of course, when they face an established hegemony like America, America's been spending on defense decade after decade, built a huge carrier fleet, sophisticated integrated systems. You can't just suddenly make that, however rich you are. So all hegemonic challengers find asymmetric systems. The Germans use U-boats, for example, when they didn't have a battle fleet. They didn't have carriers. And in the case of China, I was very alert to what weapon system they would develop, which would overturn the balance of power. So when in 2016, there were rumors, in 18 it was confirmed, they'd built and turned ballistic rockets, which really in the Cold War only carried on the whole nuclear warheads, and they'd turn them into conventional delivery systems to kill carriers, initially because they were inaccurate and the carrier was big and could compensate. That was the thing for me. That's what they were focusing on. Missile powers that could saturate naval defenses and kill carrier groups. And when I started to raise the alarm, people laughed. They really, I mean, in the West, people just didn't realize what it was. America was incredibly arrogant and slow to respond to the threat. And it reminds me an awful lot of a Navy, like the Royal Navy, built on battleships. And we did actually, were right at the forefront of carrier power, but we didn't realize what carrier power was. It was actually the thing that was going to supersede battleship power. But even we made mistakes like the Renown and the Prince of Wales coming out of Singapore without air cover and being sunk easily. We still didn't truly understand the power of carriers, even though we'd used our own carriers to sink the Italian fleet at Taranto and given the Japanese the idea for Pearl Harbor. It hadn't sunk in. So I think there's something similar. When you build a power structure on certain weapon systems, you still believe they're preeminent. And what we've seen since then is from shorter range DF-21s to DF-26s, which can go 2,500 miles, and obviously have much more accurate sensors to kill carriers and warships. The numbers are this. Each Aegis-class destroyer carries 96 Mark 41 vertical cells. Now, in those cells, they have to carry missiles to kill submarines, missiles like TLAMs, which are land attack missiles, cruise missiles in effect, and missiles which will defend against air attack. And now, so let's just assume they carry 20 SM-6s, 20. And that's the rocket which can now kill a ballistic missile in flight. And we must assume that when the US Navy helped to protect Israel, it used 5 or 6 of those to kill ballistic weapons that were overflying. So 20 of those, and you can only direct, this is so interesting, 28 in the air, and you need 2 of them to make a kill. So at best, you can kill, each destroyer can kill 10 incoming ballistic ship-killing missiles. That means three destroyers, 1 carrier, 31 missiles. The 31st kills the carrier or damages it. The 32nd, 34th, 35th finishes it off. So actually the saturation levels are quite low. And that was what really alarmed me, is the saturation is cheaper to build the missiles than it was to build the defenses and ships. And the Americans, from being sleepy, you've seen them, you probably saw them around a couple of years ago. They put 3 carrier groups together and like put more and more destroyers together to try and increase the saturation level to their fleet. And that's one of their solutions. But the solution for the Chinese is build more rockets, build more weapons. And then more recently, they did something which is even more alarming. They created a hypersonic glide weapon, which is launched off the same type of missile. But these things, instead of coming down in a predictable trajectory, which you can intercept, chink like crazy, they fly at high speed and they move erratically, which means they're uninterceptable. They also, it's thought, go so fast they create a plasma in front of them, which deflects radar signals. Now, I can't confirm it or not, but it's certainly an interesting thing because we don't have any hypersonic glide weapons to test against. but it's certainly a consideration. Can you see the system as it comes in? But even if you can see it, you can't intercept it. So right now, I think American carrier power is quite simply dead. Why the Americans forward deploy their carriers into a region where they'll be the first to go is just weird to me. I think they should accept they can't use carriers inside 2,500 or the 1,500 mile envelope from Chinese weapons, and find other ways to patrol the space, or use destroyers more than they use carriers to patrol and assert themselves. So it's already happened, this power transfer. And I would argue that even the invasion of Ukraine would not have happened if this weapon system hadn't created such a threat to US power. Now, there are some compensations. So the US is desperate. And the problem is that it basically, in its confidence, shortened the operational range of its strike fighters to about 600 miles. In fact, the ideal carrier distance for an operation is about 500 miles that creates a right target cyclicity for the number of planes it can launch in a day. Now, all the Chinese had to do was create a weapon that pushed the carrier out to 700 or 800 miles, and life became really difficult because they didn't carry in-flight refueling planes like they used to 10, 15 years ago. But now it's even worse. They have to go 1,500 miles. So the US Navy is trying to turn what was a stealthy tanker called Stingray into a weapons delivery system that can go 2,000 miles and now escape the range of these weapons. So we've got the standoff range battle happening, but America's reacting, and slowly, to the challenge. Now, lasers, energy weapons, they're all coming online. And lasers are not strong enough at the moment. They're roughly 50 kilowatt lasers. You need 300 kilowatts to really do damage, because you have to dwell the spot of the laser on the incoming target and track it. So we're 2 or 3 years away from solving the problem of the Chinese hegemonic challenge. And in that window, I believe that's where we are. We're really weak. All of the things are happening because American hegemonic power has been questioned. So in time, if they don't lose their carriers in the initial strike, they keep them out of the Chinese, targeting range, which I would if I were them, because you're then involved in a longer war where you re-equip your carriers with defensive systems that work, longer range strike capability, and you bring them back in 2 years and start to go and impinge upon the Chinese industrial base. The US Air Force is probably the best strike arm available because it has 140 long-range bombers. It's so desperate to maintain them, it pulled a B-1 out of a scrapyard and rebuilt it at a stupendous cost when it lost one in a fire. Because long-range bombing, whether it's B-1s, B-21 or B-2s rather, B-1s and Stratoforters, they're all going to be the only way to get to China easily because carrier power can't. And of course, submarine power is the other successful area that you can expect to carry on. Although I think somewhere in this conflict, gravitational sensors, which are quantum based, could open the oceans up like a can. So we're going to see huge revolutions in military affairs as this goes off, because that's what wars are. They're innovative competitions. But we are not prepared for this. And our mindset hasn't allowed for the arrival of a different weapon system. Just because they protected against the 100 or so ballistic weapons that flew into Israel doesn't mean you can protect against 3 or 4 or 500 at once. So I think there's an awful lot more bad news to come, and we're on the back foot. And our politicians are really, as a group of people, in Britain, for example, there was a law passed somewhere around 1830 where so many ex-soldiers basically went in to be MPs. And we made a rule that only 25% of the standing house could be serving military men. If you go now, you're lucky to find anyone with military service anywhere in the Western world, maybe in America more than any other place. But the net effect is we've demilitarized our understanding of strategic thinking and the weapons challenge which we now face.
And of course, our governments are looking incredibly weak, and it's down to that empire model, which I think is just such a powerful part of your analysis, which is the breakdown of empires and that stage where you turn internally on yourself, that you're no longer concentrated on the threats from the outside, but instead you're concentrating on the bickering on the inside, which is, what we've seen. I mean, it's interesting with the and we touched on this a little bit last time, but I mean, it's happening more and more with the mass protests that was particularly in London. I mean, it must be a very difficult atmosphere. Is it London? Are you living in London or are you elsewhere?
No, I live outside, but I will say that the protests we saw over Israel, I think we need to wake up as to what really caused them. They were, because I got into a cab to find a traumatized cab driver who said, I've just had someone in my car who's paid for by the Qatari government to come along and create mayhem in the riots. So I think the riots were not spontaneous anti-Israeli events. They were external autocratic systems acting and using our freedom of speech against us. And we need to be very mindful of the level of infiltration we are facing from autocratic systems, whether they're Iran, Russia, and especially China, that are actually using our freedom of speech against us. And I think it's a huge problem.
It's the response that's interesting to me, though, because I know that on the ground here, when they've happened, the police have actually been frightened to confront the crowd. So they want to keep anybody that's going to walk through the crowd, that is if you away. They want to keep the people away and almost protect the protest from anything outside that might turn that protest violent, because they're incapable of coping with the violence that might come from that. So they're turning a blind eye to it. And I think that's like
it's another aspect of the collective culture of appeasement. And it really is appeasing someone who's violently protesting against you and containing them, rather than actually having the courage to confront it and face it face to face and face it down. And I think that's across our society. It's very consistent, as you say, with the hallmarks of decline, where we've just become soft. There's that really, lovely phrase about, tough men. I've used the quote, but I've forgotten it. It's basically about tough men make good times and weak men make hard times. And right now we are suffering from the hard times induced by terribly weak leadership. Biden was a weak man before he was old. And Sunak is the person in the corner who basically never spoke up in the classroom because he wasn't able to do so, couldn't stand up for himself. And yet he's our prime minister, a technocrat with no moral fiber whatsoever when it comes to facing down aggression. I'm not saying he's a bad person, but I'm saying it takes a particular type of moral fiber to go up to a bully and say, you need to stop that now, and to risk themselves in the process. And that's what we need. We need the courage that will face down bullies, and before they truly get out of control and everyone pays the price. Now, sadly, I think it's too late. We've sent too many signals. We're too exposed. Our population is too in denial. And I really sympathize, and I've thought about this with the gentleman you mentioned about, being concerned, shooting the messenger, which happens to be me. And occasionally people use the word, you're a warmonger. Well, I'm not sure how I could be described as a warmonger when my prime motivation has been to warn that conflict was coming, that we need to spend money on defense to create effective deterrence so we wouldn't have a war. And now we're in a state where we're completely deluded and asleep, and our young and our children are all at stake. And I'm definitely shouting loudly because I have children, and I did this to warn people. And yet still people think that if you talk about war, you're a warmonger. If you went to China, Iran, Russia, and that particular person or any person in denial could hear how those human predators describe their plans and ambitions, they would understand just really what warmongers are. They're the people that seek expansion by using their nation against another, are completely unrespectful of the blood it causes because of their ambitions. That's a warmonger. Seeking full spectrum deterrence is the opposite. It's a peacemaker. And that's essentially how I view my mission in terms of explaining to people where we are, how to survive, what to do, and how to adapt so that we can survive.
I think there is
a challenge of our own making, by the way.
I mean, there's definitely more I think the more and more people listen to you, the more they can start to piece together the patterns that you're talking about, to be able to see the picture a little bit more clearly themselves. I mean, certainly that's occurred with me since our correspondence has been happening. I mean, it kind of crystallizes your thinking. And it's quite a terrifying prospect, because it almost feels like, well, it doesn't almost feel, it is inevitable to me that we are heading towards a period of global conflict, and how that's going to play out is yet to be seen. But the analysis that you give on it is not painting a great picture of where we stand and what could potentially happen. I mean, one of the other questions that I had was how can you paint a picture of how wartime economy would affect day-to-day life in Australia? What industries are impacted, jobs, spending, food availability, healthcare, medical supplies, mortgage defaults, etc. I mean, that's from subscribers that are preparing themselves
Well,
for
I think there's a couple of things you just touched upon. One is, I guarantee you, if we remain in denial, the outcome is inevitable. If we wake up, it's still probably inevitable, but we might adapt a bit quicker. And because we've collectively chosen delusion and blindness, we are going to hit a brick wall very hard. Our current leadership is going to go down with it. And all we can hope is there are enough pieces and we have enough collective resistance and will to resist that we reconstruct our leadership with lateral adaptive leadership, and we start to make sure that we can create a resistance. Now, if you look at Ukraine, they were lucky that Zelensky was in power because he's that leader and he was there already. They were lucky. We don't have that in sight. We don't have someone to marshal the initial years when it's going to be very dark, as it was for Britain from 39 to 42, as it was all the way from 1914 to 16. It was very dark. And we've got to remind ourselves that it's going to be dark until we get the right people in the right slots who are adaptive, lateral, and have the vision to navigate us through. And right now, by waking up early, we can start to make the shouts and at least not choose any other weak leaders. At least we can put pressure on our weak leaders to show that they're not functioning for us and start to do the preparatory work. So I think denial will kill us, guaranteed. And though it's very hard, and often there's a conversation with my partner about trying not to trigger the adrenal glands in people that then shut them down because they can't cope with it, and then they don't listen to the message, is something I've been really trying to modify and adapt to. But I'm here to say, once you accept the reality, then you can start to solve for the problem. At the moment, we're not even seeing the problem, and we're totally vulnerable.
The other two questions that I've got here was, you made a forecast for a major global economic crash in 2023. Is that correct? Did you say that markets were going to collapse in 2023? That was
no, I got the peak. I sold the peak of the what was it, the 21? I sold the peak in November 21. So I was short from the highs. And therefore I was running my shorts from really high levels. And that's one of the things about all my market predictions. They have entry points and they have risk rewards. You know, I'm running gold from 1800 and silver from 20. So, you know, literally my predictions, and very often people hear about the prediction at the bottom, and then if it reverses and they get short at the bottom, say, well, you said, well, actually, I picked the exact high within 1% of the NASDAQ and all the other US stock markets and ran it down. And then I had stop losses, which took it out. So I did think that we might go down further then. And I was surprised about, you know, how we actually recovered. But I'm short all over again, right at the highs. And we made ratchet money from the decline, if that makes sense. So for those people that follow my market work, it's professional and it has updates. And when I do my Murrination work, you know, you can say I like gold, but I might change my mind tomorrow. So just because you heard this in 3 weeks doesn't mean I like gold in 3 weeks' time. And if you want to get the updates, you have to subscribe to that. And if not, you have to understand conceptually, you know, I think that precious metals will carry on a long way. I think Bitcoin will make new highs. And that's been a consistent call to help people try and understand where they want to be. What they don't want to be is in the stock markets, in my opinion, especially going into a conflict.
I mean, obviously, I'm forecasting as per the 18-year cycle, which gives us a very sort of clear indication in my analysis that we're heading for a peak around 2026 in the real estate market, potentially in the stock market as well, the peak in the stock market is obviously harder to pin. Have you taken anything from that cycle into your own analysis? That was really from the same person that asked that question. He was curious to know, because I know that, you know, in the cycle that I forecast, we expect gold to kind of rally towards the top of that cycle. You know, obviously people are sensing that there is, you know, economic pain potentially ahead. So they're making a run for those hedge.
Look, I think the one thing you can really take home is that stock markets don't like wars. Unless they're the aggressor and they're making progress, as Germany's stock market was from the time it started the war through to Stalingrad. It rallied all the way through that. But we're going to be on the back foot we're going to be literally reeling under the blows. So I don't think our stock market will like it at all. And I think we can assume our bond markets really crash and rates go up, and that won't do anything for stocks. So I can't see that cycle operating that way. I think we know the secondary high that we've had, we didn't have it in the, funny enough, we didn't have in the Russell. It's quite interesting because the Russell has been my favorite core short pattern. And we sold the high of the Russell at the same time we sold the high of the NASDAQ. The NASDAQ regained those highs after dipping significantly. The Russell has never got close. And the Russell is by far the best representation of the US collective economy with 2,000 companies in, often most of them being debt-ridden. So in terms of which stock market you look at, it's quite important because the real stock market, not the Magnificent Seven and the narrow base of investment, which is so unhealthy, actually has never recovered from that peak I mentioned.
Mm. And in an interview that I was listening to, you were talking about, you looking at gold markets and also drawing conclusions from those about people, running for a hedge, which of course also is what Bitcoin has kind of been.
So one of the things, I mean, Bitcoin is, as far as I'm concerned, a safe haven mechanism in a window before quantum computers break the crypto chain, the blockchain, which is going to happen quicker than people think. But for right now, I can see, Bitcoin towards 96, possibly 120. And I was able to pick the 16 low and be long of it from there. So it's been a great trade. And gold and silver is just, all I can say is it has a lot of upside, and so do its associated mining companies. But of course, people will enter at much higher because they're slow, and they'll go, well, I bought it up here at 10,000 and then it went down, and you told me to. Well, that's your responsibility, because if you want to follow my trade recommendations, pay for them. Don't just get the cheap versions on the podcast because it's generically where we're going. But I do think they are probably the only safe haven that I could identify. And I did an extensive study on financial markets in World War I and World War II, which my investors can read, and it's fascinating. And one of the things it talks about, or I highlighted, is stock markets often reversed at the turning points of World War I and World War II. They before the turning points, not through cause and effect. They almost could sense what was happening next. And I've developed a much more comprehensive thought process as to what markets really are. And if you accept that we live in a quantum mechanical universe, somehow or another, markets are able to almost be ahead of the probability that unfolds before it does. And I'll give you two examples that really stand out to me, or three examples actually. The first was the British stock market went down from 1914 all the way to 1918. And it turned round in July 1918. And there was a little battle at Bohamel, which was 90 minutes, fought by the Australian Corps. And it was the first combined arms operation on a brigade scale. It was brilliant. And it became the forerunner for the Battle of Amiens. And actually, a month before the Battle of Amiens, when no general knew it was going to be fought, the stock market made its low. Now, that's kind of interesting. But then you go and look at the Battle of the Coral Sea. And in fact, that was when, just before the Battle of the Coral Sea, the US stock market made its low. Then you go and look at 1940. The British stock market made its low 1 month before the 15th of September, and we were losing the Battle of Britain at the time. So there is something going on. It is not a cause and effect process. And it's something to do with the way that the probabilities in a quantum mechanical world work, that maybe as humans, we are in fact quantum mechanical computers and brains, and somehow we work out the probability collectively of what will happen before we know the details of it. But it raises some huge philosophical questions, which, I've talked about a lot in my work. And I just think gold and silver doing what they were doing after Bitcoin, I was warning everyone, this is a safe haven move before we know what the safe haven trigger is. So watch out. And it was always been the window when I thought China could escalate or get its proxies to escalate, as Iran did. So it proved to be particularly prescient and a warning that most people missed.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Thank you so much, David. Of course, I'm not going to end without encouraging people to subscribe to your service and to get your depth of insight, which is just, I don't know anyone else that goes into such detail about or such incredible analysis about global events as you do, but as you say, your forecasts as well are extremely interesting. And the fact that you understand the role of land in war and in the economies and the importance of taking that into account in your analysis is also exceptional as well.
Well, I mean, I have to say, what is one thing that you can't get rid of is land. You can have your gold taken off you by government, but as long as you can have land and you have some way of holding the title, then basically land is actually the ultimate arbiter in the nightmare scenario.
Yeah, which is why the cycle that I talk about is so important. I mean, land is fundamental to everything that we do. We live on it, sleep on it, work on it, bury our dead in it. We gain all our sustenance from it. And of course, it gives location value. And it is that title to gain from that locational value that the government gives you when you own a piece of land that is so powerful, of which the financial system is choreographed around because it lends predominantly against land, you can't get a business loan without having some form of land. And so it is so important. And of course, Australia's economy is very leaned towards the land market. Our economy really is choreographed around the land market. And obviously we have our great mineral wealth as well, which is playing into Perth's economy at the moment, which is why Perth is doing so well. So, I'm really watching that Kondratieff peak with
and it will keep doing so.
Until the peak. Let's just question that, because the peak, I would say that the Kondratieff peak from my own research would be around 2027. I don't know that you can put an exact year so much on this cycle, considering
I think it's a lot. I think it's the peak is going to be 2030. So it's a bigger peak than that. So and we've got a long way to go, in effect, before we reach all of these conclusion of these things. And in fact, the peak for World War I was 2020, 2021. So we started 7 years beforehand.
Yeah, which of course would be a 100-year cycle, although the 90-year cycle is also important. But that's interesting. So that would be the peak in the commodity markets that you would be talking about.
And it's a big one. It's a 112-year cycle, not 56. So the magnitude of this is going to be so much bigger than the one we experienced in 75.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Have you ever seen those Samuel Benner's chart, or George's chart? I'll send you some information after this. It's a 150-odd-year-old chart that Samuel Benner, who was a commodity trader at the time, he was wiped out in the pig cholera panic. He was wiped out in the 1873 panic, basically, and he decided to dedicate his time to working out the peak and the crashes in markets. And he put together effectively a timetable, which is, timetable with a lot of arrows like this, buy here, sell there, buy here, sell there. And because it's extrapolating it out, it forecasts all our recent, peaks and downturns as well. And of course, it runs on a 54-year panic cycle. Doesn't quite correlate with the Kondratieff cycle, but it's very close. But there was a chap called, trying to remember his name now. I can't remember his name. I reached out to him for an interview, which I will try and get hold of him for an interview. But he said it's more like a 56-year cycle, panic cycle, rather than a 54.
But one of the things that I'm going to leave you with, and we'll perhaps talk about next time, is if I'm correct, and this is really some entropic pulse that surges through human societies, it leaves you with the question of what is it? Where does it come from? What purpose does it serve? And they're very profound questions and potentially profound answers. But we'll leave that for next time.
Yes, and I can't wait for next time. And I also, I want to get to a stage where I can bring you to Australia and we can do some seminars together. That's my ambition at the moment with Land Cycle Investor, to get us to a stage where we can have seminars, and I would love to have you here. That's assuming that we're not in an all-out war that will prevent.
That'd be great. As long as the plane can land safely, I'll be.
Yes, some that prevent travel. I don't want to, put your life at danger or anything. But anyway, thank you so much, David. I so appreciate you being on the show. It's an absolute delight to me to talk to you. It's a really, really interesting, always interesting conversation. So thank you very much.
It's always a joy to be interrogated by you, Catherine.
Thank you
very much.